Okay, welcome everyone. I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for joining us for our first virtual Parlor chat. My name is Megan Byrnes and I am the programs manager at Morris-Jumel Mansion. We're excited to have Jessa Krick from Historic Hudson Valley join us tonight to talk about a woman who has connections with both of our historic sites, Mary Philipse Morris. Before we begin and start to delve into Mary Philipse Morris, I just would like to briefly go over a few guidelines for our conversation tonight. Virtual parlor chats are meant to be an informal look at our house's history with experts and Q&A, as well as conversation and connections to the present day. So our game plan for tonight is as follows. Jessa and I will be in conversation for about 40 to 45 minutes with pauses in between to take questions from the chat. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. We'll only take a couple as we're having our discussion, but there will be at least 10 to 15 minutes after our discussion for a more general Q&A at that time. There's no need to mute. It's already automatically done so in this format until we get to the question and answer period. Also, a reminder tonight, we are recording this chat as well as live streaming on Facebook. So this chat will become available after our presentation this evening. So let's get started and delve into Mary Philipse Morris. Mary Philipse Morris was born into the wealthy and powerful land-owning Phillips family in 1730. She was an heiress whose life and legacy are intertwined, as I said, with both Morris-Jumel Mansion and Phillipsburg Manor from historic Hudson Valley and Tarrytown. She's particularly relevant to Morris-Jumel Mansion, which wouldn't exist without her, as we will discuss shortly. One reason why I was really intrigued to approach Jessa and conduct some more research on her is because her role is often overshadowed by the men in her life, whether it's her father, to a rumored romance with George Washington. And we really wanted to go back to the historical sources and find out more about the real woman sort of behind all the myths. And to help me tonight is Jessa Krick. Jessa currently serves as Historic Hudson Valley's Associate Director of Collections. She cares for the art and objects located at Historic Hudson Valley's historic sites, and she oversees the institution's library and archives. In her work with the education team at HHV, she was a lead researcher for the recent People Not Property documentary. And I have to congratulate you and your team, Jessa, because you recently received the 2020 Webby Awards for that project.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We just heard about that. So
we'll be definitely talking a little bit more about that in our conversation. And you also work on ongoing projects related to Historic Hudson Valley's Women's History Institute. So it seems like talking about a woman like Mary Philipse Morris, it's right up your alley. And so as we start to talk about Mary herself, I'd love to ask you, when did you become interested in learning a bit more about Mary Philipse? What can you tell us about her?
Sure. So I really discovered the power of Mary Philipse. We had taken this portrait to an exhibition in 2012, an exhibition of objects from all the historic Hudson Valley sites. And this one particularly attracted attention from visitors to this exhibition. After they asked if they didn't know who is this woman, the next most common question was, didn't she have a relationship with George Washington?
Mm-hmm.
So I really was intrigued by the fact that that's one fact, if people knew anything about Mary, that's the rumor maybe, or the story that they had heard about her. So again, this presentation was a perfect chance to sort of delve even more deeply into the bits of information that we've been gathering, and of course some of the recent research that's happened into Mary's life as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, I can speak from a lot of the interpretation that we do at our site. Sometimes, at least in my experience, Mary Philipse Morris is kind of mentioned in passing. But I think this represents a really, this conversation and the research represents a really exciting opportunity to bring her a little more into the foreground in some of our storytelling.
Absolutely. So this is the portrait of Mary Philipse that I was talking about from the Historic Hudson Valley collection. And even though it's unsigned, it's attributed to John Wollaston. And it was painted about 1750, when Mary was just about 20 years old at that time. It seems that Wollaston painted Mary and all of her siblings at that time. And we can sort of create a virtual family reunion here with paintings from the collections of Historic Hudson Valley and the New York Historical Society and the Museum of the City of New York. And so I just want to point out the Margaret Philipse portrait on the left side of your screen.
In
sort
green.
of companion piece to Mary in the Historic Hudson Valley collection. And oftentimes eagle-eyed people will also ask, why don't they seem to have any arms? I just want to dispense with that right away and say that the portrait is painted with these sort of black borders on it, as if there's a liner to the frame. So it's taking the rectangular canvas and turning it into this sort of oval framing device. So it's conveniently cutting off the arms. In the 18th century, portrait painters charged extra for these waist-length portraits that had hands and arms in them, or a very detailed background, as you see with the portraits on the upper part of the screen on the other side. So it's a little bit of an economy measure here to have Mary and Margaret with their arms trimmed off a little bit. When you visit the Morris-Jumel Mansion or you visit Phillips Manor Hall today, you'll encounter this image and Mary. It's one of two really well-known portraits of her. Can you just go back to the Mary? Yeah, that's great. She's a little bit difficult to know, I think, in this portrait. It's so formal and she's very staid here, but she has all the trappings of a young woman of society. She's got her yellow silk dress and the lace trim at the neckline and on her cap. She has the black ribbon that's sort of framing her face and drawing attention to her neck. Both the flowers on her dress, at the little bouquet, and the woman herself are really in full bloom here. And these are many of the clues to Mary's status at this time, and they're included in this portrait.
So one of the things that I'm curious for you to tell us a little bit more about is, clearly she is a young woman of society, as are her siblings. From where did the Phillips family wealth come from? Because they are a well-established landed gentry by this point. Absolutely.
Just go ahead and advance to the two Phillips family properties. There's this is really the locations where Mary's story kind of comes into play. It's also key to understanding the status of the Phillips family. And that's really helpful for understanding what happens to Mary in the course of her life. In the decades before Mary's painting was created, two generations of the Phillips family were building a fortune in New Amsterdam and in New York. two properties that stood on the vast land holding of the Phillips family still exist today. And that's Phillipsburg Manor on the left. It's a property of historic Hudson Valley. It's called Phillipsburg Manor Upper Mills. And then Phillips Manor Hall on the right. It's owned by New York State now, and it was referred to as Phillips Manor Lower Mills, the Lower Mills property. Phillipsburg Manor was a provisioning plantation. It was a working plantation. It was a commercial center, working mill. It was a shipping hub, vital to the Phillips family trade network. The Manor Hall, the Lower Mills property, also had a working mill and some business that was happening there too, but it was also the country house for the growing family. That of Frederick Phillips II and later third especially are putting their imprint on this house.
Mm-hmm. Now, in addition to this, the Phillips family also had at least one townhouse in New York City, in Lower Manhattan, what we would call Lower Manhattan today, correct?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And there's, to my knowledge, there's not an image of that property, but we have a good sense of its location, and a lot of Phillips family land holdings, real estate and estate holdings are really a big piece of the family as well.
Mm-hmm. And like her parents, and the lifestyle to which she was accustomed, when Mary ends up marrying herself, is where our property, or rather the city of New York's property, Morris-Jumel Mansion, currently located in Washington Heights, comes into play, because Mary and her husband also had a townhouse in Lower Manhattan. So this was constructed and completed in 1765 as their summer estate. Must be nice. So going back to the Phillips family wealth, so they're merchants. Can you tell me a little bit more about what types of things they were producing at the provisioning plantation and who was there?
Yeah, so just go right ahead to the next slide. Yeah, so we have the abbreviated Phillips family tree here. Frederick Phillips made his way to the New World from the Netherlands in about 1653 or so. Mm-hmm. By most accounts, he seems to have been the son of a carpenter, and he quickly began building a fortune in the colony the old-fashioned way, by marrying well. Mm. He married a wealthy widow called Margaret Hardenbrook de Vries, and she herself was an astute woman of business. Can you just advance to the next one? Yeah, so there's no portrait of Margaret and Frederick I, but we often use this image, the New Amsterdam image, shows Dutch traders, and so I sort of have Margaret and Frederick in my mind when I'm looking at this image particularly. They had both full and partial stakes in several ships that crossed the Atlantic. With just about every successful trip, they expanded their fortunes. Mm-hmm. Frederick had been granted a patent, and he continued to buy land up the Hudson River in points north, including much of what we think of as Westchester, Dutchess and Putnam counties are part of the Phillips family land holdings in this period. In 1700, his property was divided among his eldest surviving son, Adolph, and that's Adolph's portrait there from the Museum of the City of New York, and his own grandson and the namesake, Frederick II. If you just want to go back to that family tree for a second, so Frederick in the first generation marries Margaret. They have a number of children, 11 children or something along those lines. Wow. Frederick, his son Philip dies, predeceases Frederick. So Frederick II inherits, and then Adolf Phillips does not have any children. So his fortune also goes to Frederick II. So Frederick II gets a double share of wealth. Right. And this is the moment where we can really cue some coins dropping sound effects here, because Frederick too is the big beneficiary, as are his children, including Mary.
Right, and Mary is the middle daughter here, has an older sister, Susanna, who's also going to become important as we get into Mary's life just before the Revolution and after. Okay. Going back to this picture of New Amsterdam, I noticed that there are people at the woman's feet. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about them.
Absolutely, absolutely. The Phillips family is involved in the trade of goods, but they are also heavily involved in the trade of enslaved Africans from Africa. Frederick Phillips and from Madagascar. Frederick Phillips says that his chiefest profit comes from Negroes. And I use that term, but it's coming from the documentation at the time. It's not a word that I'm choosing to use myself here. So it is really, their fortune is built very much on the labor of enslaved people who are not seeing any of the profit of their labor. All of the efforts that they are putting in, they are building Phillipsburg Manor, they build the mill there, they build the Old Dutch Church. They're incredibly involved in all of the infrastructure of what we think of as New York City now. And they are so often left out of the historical record and also not acknowledged for the work that they have put in.
Right. And that is a big topic of discussion with us at Morris-Jumel Mansion too, because visitors to the mansion ask, you know, were there enslaved people involved in the construction? Were they working at the house? There's been, you know, discussions that there may be a document that Mary inherited to enslaved women from her father, but we're still trying to uncover that historic evidence. You, however, though, at Phillipsburg Manor, have one document in particular that really speaks to the people who were living and working at the manor.
Yeah. And that is this inventory here. This is, as I said, Adolf Phillips dies in 1750, and he doesn't have an heir. So there's this probate inventory. So an inventory of all of the contents of all of his properties, including his home and his warehouse in Lower Manhattan. And this is an internal page of that inventory, but it's the first page that shows the manor of Phillipsburg, and you can see that at the top, followed by the most valuable property at that site, the 23 enslaved men, women, and children who appear in the order of their value as given by the man who is writing up this document. And it is really a stark reminder of who was doing the labor that built the Phillips family fortune. We have listed at the top Caesar, who we think was the master miller at Phillipsburg Manor, all the way through, you can see in the middle a group of men who are not fit for work, which means they're probably too old to do work. So again, in the view of the person writing this document, they have less value because they're not fit. Then we have the children, the boys, their ages from 9 all the way down to 1 year and 4 months. That's Harry. And then Betty, a girl aged 3. Oof. Followed then by the cattle and the silver and 1 gun and all the things that are also considered property at Phillipsburg Manor.
It's a very stark and heartbreaking list, particularly to see the children as well and Betty listed before things like the cattle. It seems like there's more men and boys as well that are at the site.
Yeah, so this is one of the, a little bit of a mystery, but we also speculate that because Phillipsburg Manor, Upper Mills, was not a place where there were many visitors. As I said, Adolf was unmarried. So we think one of the reasons why there aren't a lot of girls on this list is that they were perhaps sent to Phillips Manor Lower Mills, to Frederick Phillips II and his family. So those girls would have experience in learning about cooking for guests, cooking for the enslaver's family, cooking for their enslavers, working as ladies' maids and doing fine laundry, those types of tasks that were more in a upper class household, which was a little different than what the situation was at Phillipsburg Manor Upper Mills, which was much more of a commercial center. Adolf Phillips was not often in residence there.
So in all likelihood, Mary and her siblings would have grown up very much from an early age.
Absolutely. She was raised in a household where the presence of enslaved people was completely routine. We don't know the names of the people who may have personally waited on Mary and helped her to dress in her yellow silk gown, or gotten the firewood or drawn the water for her tea, but they were undoubtedly there. I just would like to mention the work of Mary Brophy on the Phillips family efforts to erase their own legacy of slave ownership. And there's an essay now on the Columbia University website, Columbia University and Slavery. You can see a number of research papers there. I particularly am struck by Megan's work, because it talks about the efforts that the family went to when they were donating papers to Columbia University. Frederick Phillips was a governor of King's College, and the family tried to eradicate all the mentions of slavery and slaveholding from those documents. There's a few references that they missed, and we certainly know about it from ample other historical documents, but that's really an interesting part of the family's legacy in the 19th century, and trying to
revive
really the history of where their family money had come from.
And that article that you mentioned is also going to be sent out along with a survey at the conclusion of this broadcast. So for those of you who want to learn more about that, you should definitely check that out. And I'm sure the Phillips family was not the only family that wanted to expunge some of this legacy.
Oh yeah, that's what makes researching this topic quite difficult. And so I would also just take a look at our People Not Property website, as we're very proud of all the research that went into that, and a number of different stories from different sites throughout the northern colonies. You know, Phillipsburg is just one example, and we really tried to put that into a larger context and talk about stories and enslaved individuals from other sites as well.
Okay, so at this moment in time, I would love to take a brief pause for a couple of questions. Meg, our educator and co-host this evening, is monitoring some of the discussion. Meg, do you have any questions for us?
So we do have one question. It's sort of a fun question from Alyssa. She wants to know, were the Phillips sons who were named Phillips then called Philip Phillips?
Yes, they were.
So a little redundant, but
like Chris Christie in New Jersey, right?
It's true. We're still doing it today. So I'd kind of like to switch gears here. We're talking about Mary's formative years, and I would like to really revisit the Wollstone portrait as we kind of segue into what was her life like as a young woman prior to marriage. And of course, we can investigate some of this discussion of a potential romantic relationship with George Washington. From what I have been able to surmise from documents at the time and Mary, being an eligible heiress, was moving in sort of high society circles. And we get a little sense, albeit via satire, by our next slide, of a satire of, as she is named, Captain Polly Phillips' conquests, romantic conquests. This list, and we can provide a transcription later because I know it is hard to read, but this list is compiled by Timothy Scandal, so we don't know who this anonymous person is. But what is really interesting is when we're thinking about Mary's life at this time is that this satire lists at least 30 different romantic prospects with various designations. Again, they're using this military metaphor with the killed, wounded, deserted, and discharged, etc. So it's, it is tongue-in-cheek, but perhaps speaks to, maybe Mary's reputation or, a desirable prospect perhaps to wed for some of these individuals, many of whom are military. One of the other things that I think is really interesting about this document is, guess whose name is not on this list? George Washington, even though it's from 1756, which is around about the time that he supposedly met Mary at her brother-in-law's house, Beverly Robinson, at the time that his interest or their relationship may have begun. The other thing that's really interesting, I think, is about midway on the left-hand page, you might be able to make it out, the name of Captain Roger Morris, who will be Mary's future husband. And his designation is, quote, shot through the heart, as smitten with Mary. And if we go a bit further, again, to my mind as a historian here, a lot of the basis for this relationship with George Washington seems to rest a lot on letters from a mutual friend of both Mary's family and George Washington, Joseph Chew. And we will have a link to these letters also at the end of this broadcast. But you can see from some of these excerpts here, particularly the middle, from July 13th, 1757, he's talking about charming Polly, and he's also gently ribbing his friend George in these letters about Roger Morris was there, quote, don't be startled, but not always. He's a ladies' man. And a little bit later, he's kind of prodding his friend a little bit in the last quote that if he cares about her, he should make his intentions known and should come back to New York. So, I mean, it seems like there's a lot of smoke, Jessa. Is there actually fire here?
Well, again, we don't have anything in Mary's own words about what this relationship might have been or what her perspective on this was. There are embellishments and embroidery that happens over the century that this after this encounter happened. After this meeting, again, we don't exactly know what was happening there, but we know who Mary ends up marrying. We know who George ends up marrying, and so again, a brief moment without a lot of tremendous amount of evidence on either side from either of the two players who would have really known what happened.
But it is something that is definitely compelling and, has inspired people.
Oh, yes.
Even until recently, I know that author Mary Calvi wrote a really interesting historic fictional version of what this relationship might have been like, you know, being inspired by some of the historic documents that we've been referring to tonight. So there really is a bit of a romanticism that really.
I kind of think it's human nature to sort of fill in the gaps of what might have happened there, and imagine different outcomes, or if someone had really been on a fly on the wall in that room. I think it's very, very tempting to imagine what could have transpired.
But to your point, we know who Mary ultimately chose. Roger Morris, shown here. I tried to find a better image. It's hard to come by a good image of him. So we just made do. They were married in 1758. And again, as a women's historian myself, one of the things that I find really fascinating about Mary and Roger is that they seem to be adhering to Anglo-Dutch law when it came to a pre-marriage contract of sorts. And in this contract, which again is going to become really important after the Revolution, when it comes to land rights, since both Roger Morris and Mary will be loyalists, they will support the crown. But in this marriage contract, Mary actually shares ownership of her land rights and the ability to buy and sell land, which is something that is very different from, you know, many British women at this time who, under common law, really are legally covered by their husband's identity, that are unable to really be economic and actors in their own right. The other thing that I think is really, again, salient to their Mary and Roger and their story of their children is that these land rights are meant to go to their children upon the death of both of their parents. So again, this is going to be a point of legal argument after the war when Mary and Roger's lands are confiscated. So I think that this would be a great time to pause before we go on to young Mary and her life as a young wife and mother. Are there any additional questions, Meg?
We do. We have a question from MJM family member Camilla Sally, who wants to know where did the Phillips family's slaves come from in Africa? Do we have any information about their origins?
Great question.
That's a really good question. We know that Frederick Phillips was doing a lot of dealing in and out of Madagascar, but where within Africa those slaves were coming from, those enslaved people were coming from, it's a little uncertain. They were perhaps coming from eastern points, but we also know that the port of Mpinde Soyu in what is now present-day Ghana was also a departure point as well. And so that would mean that it was a number of Akan peoples, again, the various ethnic groups within, it's sort of in that, where the west coast of Africa kind of takes that curve. So all what we're thinking of now as those countries of Ghana and Gambia are likely the origin of a number of the enslaved.
Interesting. So our next question comes from Lisa Kosen, who wants to know, why do you think the Dutch were more liberal in assigning their land rights and wealth to both husband and wife? Any theories there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess if we look back at the Phillips family, Jessa, you were talking about Frederick the First and his wife, who was often referred to as a she merchant, who was able to sort of preserve her economic interests. Um, I don't, I, I don't know
Yeah,
in particular why.
there seems to be sort of a bit more of an egalitarian sort of dynamic there. I don't know whether it's because of the sort of smaller trading community in the Netherlands, whether it has to do with the distribution of wealth among those elite classes, and then therefore when when a husband dies, those rights sort of being retained by the wife, or it's just, it's so different than what the English system is, that I really think it has to do with the business angle of the Dutch and their sort of preservation of business interests. Yes, but I mean, but why that is, I think again, in England, there's much more of a class division, and the idea that being involved in trade is not something to be done. And so, whereas the Dutch
if you are female,
that business acumen. So, you know, I think it's a fascinating detail for women's history, especially, and the idea that that is translating into a couple of generations in the New World, and then you start to see these changes where English law is creeping in, and some of those protections are broken down for women. Yes, I think that the New York Historical Society has done some good work on their website too, and it's showing other examples of the role of these Dutch women in the New World as well. We have some good stories there, some other family documentation that's survived.
Well, I'm also thinking too, I mean, we are also just looking at European cultures, English and Dutch, and in North America as well, you know, particularly in this area, we have the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederation as they're known, that are matrilineal societies as well. So it's really interesting to look at sort of these cultural comparisons and, you know, their origins, whether they're economic or philosophical. At least in Mary's case, though, she and her sister Susanna, who retain these land rights, happen to be among only a few women accused, along with their husbands, of treason by the American government. So these rights also have extreme consequences. Even though they're not taking up arms in battle, there is this movement to lump them in with their husbands and their service in order to take these lands after the war. Sort of switching gears here now to get us a better sense of, we have Mary, she is recently married. She and Roger purchased the land and began building Morris-Jumel Mansion as their summer estate. What sort of sense do you have of her as a wife and mother? What evidence is there to hint at her daily life?
Sure. Can you advance to the next screen? Yes, this is great. I love this portrait.
I love the squirrel.
Yes, of this New York child, Daniel Verplank, again, not in the Phillips family tree, but just easy to, again, imagine Mary's kids in a similar attire and accessories. So Roger and Mary have 5 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. They're Joanna, called Nancy, Amherst, Maria, Margaret, and Margaret is the one named after Mary's own sister, Margaret,
Mm.
and great-grandmother, who dies at age 2. Heartbreaking story. And then Henry Gage, born in 1770.
The youngest.
The youngest, named after General Gage. So there's some
military
here, close ties among those loyalist families. And Megan, you pointed out that there's a number of different dates even given to Margaret's birth and death. So again, just the historical record here is letting us down a little bit when it comes to Margaret, and even the idea of when she was born and died, exactly how old she was.
And this is for a well-known and prosperous family too. So if you amplify that to think of, infant mortality sadly was a fact of life regardless of socioeconomic status at this time. And so if we're having trouble getting information about Margaret, how many other infants and young children are kind of lost to history in some respects. So we can imagine, is Mary really looking after all of these children on her own? She probably has a lot of help.
It is very difficult to imagine that she would be doing this without household help. Again, that would mean enslaved women being involved in the childcare here, possibly as even wet nurses, as sort of nannies, being intimately involved with all the aspects of the family life, including the lives of the Phillips children.
And so we have the evidence of children. Do we get a sense of Mary as sort of like a woman of the house, the lady of the house? How, what sort of provision she might be getting for her family, or things that a family like this would be able to afford?
Yeah, we do. Again, with one of these documents that is just gives us a tiny little glimpse into the window onto Mrs. Colonel Morris, as she's called. This is the account book of Samuel Deal that has been identified in the New York Public Library. And in the years from 1764 to 1776, Mrs. Morris has an account with Samuel Deal. And so a number of purchases are made over the course of these years. It's never a huge shopping spree. She seems to be quite specific and quite modest. She's not buying out the store in any shape or form. She's buying things like green, white, and red ribbons. She buys gloves for herself. She buys men's stockings for her husband. She buys things like a straw hat in summer, so some seasonal purchases. Some packs of cards, a couple of packs at a time in some cases. So perhaps getting ready for a party or some entertaining. And again, we don't know for sure that she herself was going into the store and making these purchases. It's possible that she was sending an enslaved person to pick up these items and have them be charged to her account. The number of, it's a range of goods. Women's gloves in fine French kid, it's quite expensive. White flannel, quite ordinary. I wonder whether she was thinking about, children's undergarments or something like that when with sort of an ordinary purchase.
And even dentifrice.
Dentifrice. So that's like toothbrushing powder. So again, just something that is it's amazing that this record survives. This is something so small, and that there's something that really is very humanizing about seeing that Mary Philipse charged some dental powder to her account
and scouring drops, right, to scrub.
So yeah, that would have been like a cleaning solution for for clothing. So helping to get the ink out of something or a cleaning solution, really.
Well, unfortunately for Mary and her family, things are going to change quite dramatically. And in the essence of time, I'm just going to briefly discuss what I could go on and on about at leisure, which is some of the information about Mary and Roger during the Revolutionary War from letters that Roger wrote to Mary between 1775 to 1777. Even though Roger was no longer in the army, he leaves, and I am still trying to ascertain exactly the circumstances to why Roger left to go to England for 2 years and is corresponding with his wife in this series of letters. The other really frustrating aspect of this as a source is, of course, surprise, surprise, we don't have Mary's replies. So we have to sort of read between the lines and get a sense of what her letters may have contained based on his responses to her. He wrote her over 40 letters. Many are prefaced as "my dearest Maria." He even calls her "my life." And there's other signs of affection too, lamenting, quote, "our miserable situation of absence from each other." And for multiple letters, he goes on and on about how much he misses her and will she please send the miniature portrait of her so he can see her face, but not if there's a risk of losing it while it's being sent across the water. He also references this portrait, the other known portrait of Mary by John Singleton Copley, the famous portraitist shown here, that's at the Winterthur Museum. So again, we can see very much a more mature lady of fashion and fine silks. But getting to these realities of daily life as they're played out in these letters, I mean, we are very fortunate that we live in a time where communication is relatively easy. It's relatively instantaneous, via email, phone calls, text. Even if we want to learn about national or local events, we can turn on the news, we can go online. Here, it's letters. And letters that have to be entrusted to someone who is traveling either from New York to England or vice versa. So you can imagine it takes time. Sometimes letters get lost. And there's no way of knowing what is happening to the other person during those in-between times. And this is very much in evidence if you look at the second quote. Sometimes Roger, there's a period of time in summer to early fall in 1776 when the revolution is really heating up, and New York City is being overrun with troops on both sides. And he does not receive letters from Mary during that time for months, knowing that this is erupting. And he talks about getting information from Mr. Delancey, another famous landowner and loyalist, mentions your well-being on the 20th of June, but that you were obliged to leave Mount Morris that day, Mount Morris being today's Morris-Jumel Mansion, and gone to the Yonkers, which is the family manor house. So what we as historians can actually bring to this is, in fact, at this time, Mary being obliged to leave means that she has to evacuate because there's fighting in the area. So whether that means, rounding up her children, gathering, her enslaved servants, any valuables that they can carry, and leaving. If she'll return, not knowing if the house will even last. So again, even though she's a woman of privilege and status, when war comes, in some ways, she becomes a refugee, moving from place to place. things get even more dire. If you look at this map from the period from the New York Public Library, if you can see on the left-hand side, this sort of reddish tinged area, it represents the quarter of the city that was lost due to fire that fall in 1776. And we again go to the letters and see that their townhouse, Roger and Mary's townhouse, was demolished. So like many people in the city, you know, she's going back and forth looking for a place to stay. At one point, she's staying in really cramped lodgings. And really, one of the things that I think is very revealing and evocative about her and her family at this time is that she goes from buying things like lavender water, like we saw, and straw hats, to requesting her husband by 1777 to send 7 packages of food and other supplies, including ham, raisins, and groceries. So again, a really formative moment, I think, in hardship for this family.
Yeah, and you know, preserved foods that would have survived the trip across, but again, just thinking about the fact that systems are breaking down here.
Absolutely.
Even for the Phillips family, and if she's in need of asking her husband to send quantities of food like this.
And, you know, ultimately, the family, Roger does come back in December of 1777, and he oversees refugee claims on behalf of British subjects, loyalists. So he gets these letters of people who are also in dire need during the war. But by 1783, Mary, the kids have all gone back to the family estate, Roger's family estate in Yorkshire. And we can see here an image of the churchyard, the graveyard, where both Roger and Mary and some of their children are interred. Mary actually lives to quite ripe old age in her 90s. She even outlives some of her children, some of her adult children, dying in 1825. And so really, you know, thinking about, there's even more to learn about this family at this point. You know, what was life like for them as loyalists, exiles, particularly for Mary, who was born in North America, as were her children. Roger was born in England, so you know, even amongst themselves, there may have been different feelings on that point. So I would love to take some time towards the end of our discussion to really open it up to additional questions for either Jessa and myself. Again, this is just a very quick overview of a fascinating subject.
Okay. So we have a myriad of questions here. I'll start with one that covers both historic lands from Vanessa. Do we know the history of the land the Phillips family owned, including from whom the land was acquired? And she also wants to know about Morris-Jumel Mansion property.
Okay, that is a great question. That is something that some of us at the mansion have been researching. As far as Native peoples who were in the area, I know that where Morris-Jumel Mansion is located in Washington Heights, up around that area, that both the Lenape people and the Muncie people were the original inhabitants in that immediate area. And then Jessa, you were telling me also about...
Yeah. Again, that Megan Brophy article on Columbia University website, Columbia University and Slavery, has some really meaty details about nefarious land dealings by the Phillipses, particularly with the Wappinger tribe in Putnam County. There were some underhanded dealings there, absolutely, for sure. And I think, you know, she implicates Beverly Robinson, you know, Phillips' in-law, and a little bit of Roger Morris in there. You know, I can say that I think we can be pretty confident that there were the Phillipses were determined to get the best of the deal here. And unfortunately, in some cases, the law was on their side. Something that is terrible for the 21st century audience to read and really think about what that meant for for whom the law was stacked against. I think, again, the Phillips family fortune is built without regard for whom it is built upon, really.
And George Washington's as well. He was a surveyor who also took native lands. And even more recently, and sort of a twist of irony, you know, the Phillips family, at least Mary and Roger's descendants, go to court, and ultimately, in a case that goes all the way to the Supreme Court, their land rights based on that contract are not upheld, and they lose them to another prominent family and speculator, John Jacob Astor. So I guess turnabout's fair play. I don't know. Any other questions?
We have a lot. Okay, so Marianne would like to know where the Lower Manhattan Dutch townhouse was.
Where
the Lower Manhattan townhouse was that the Phillips lived in, their downtown town.
Right. I think it's the corner of Broad and Pearl Streets, I think, if that's correct. And then so Frederick Phillips owns a house there, and then Mary and Roger have a house across the street, or on that same block, either on the same side of the street or across the street. So Broad and Pearl is the neighborhood that we're talking about here.
So we have a message or a question from Ramin referring back to the discussion about Dutch women holding a bit more power and wealth. Could it have anything to do with the preservation of wealth in the family at a time when there wasn't an extended family system here in the New World, whereas women may have been left out in the old world that was not prudent here? Any thoughts on that?
I mean, what do you think, Jessa? I mean, I think that there is potentially some validity to that perspective. You know, there is, I think, a conscious interest in many of these landed families to kind of keep the wealth within. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, certainly. And I'm sort of fascinated by the fact of like how much influence comes from the home country, and then what happens to that in the New World, and where things break down, where certain things, you know, again, depending on who's, you know, Frederick Phillips was serving as a judge. So of course he has a vested interest in keeping that Phillips family money together. And so possibly, you know, are his legal decisions being colored by his personal fortune and background? It's very difficult to sort of tease out the difference between, you know, he's not impartial. He's not an impartial jurist or legislator. So that's certainly the case. Yeah, more to come on women and their Dutch heritage here.
We have a similar question about Dutch political beliefs. So were most Dutch landowners considered loyalists during this time? How did the Dutch-British conflicts from the century earlier impact this? Or was that irrelevant by the time the American Revolution rolled around?
Well, clearly, I think we're going to have to do another virtual parlor chat just on New Amsterdam. Based on this interest. That's a big question. Um, I don't know, Jessa. Do you think that Dutch landowners, not all of them, surely, were loyalists?
Yeah, it goes both ways. You have a family like the Van Cortlandt family, Dutch heritage as well, but come down on the side of the Patriots, and you know, Pierre Van Cortlandt ends up being the first lieutenant governor of New York State. So you have Dutch families on both sides of the divide. I think perhaps many more prominent English families are leaning towards the loyalists. But I think as you get further and further away from New York City into the Hudson Valley, you know, there are plenty of patriots and militiamen and folks who are rabble rousing for the cause of independence.
Right. The Van Rensselaers as well. Did they also were on the side of, or did they also split as the family?
I don't know off the top of my head. You know, and you have family divisions within the same family as well. So there are really those, you know, stories of families that are kind of split down the middle as far as where the loyalties lie.
Like Benjamin Franklin and his son, Benjamin Franklin, ardent American patriot, his son, ardent loyalist, as just one example. Okay, I think we've got time for maybe one more question. I knew this was going to happen. And so if we do not get to your question, please, by all means, email any additional thoughts to info@morrisjumel.org, because we really would love to keep this conversation going. All right, last question.
I'm going to let you ladies choose. Do you want to answer a question about the mail system, about the British Navy, or about a portrait?
I'm going to say, not being a military historian myself, I'm going to lean towards probably the portrait. I don't, Jessa?
Yeah, what's the question about what's the question about portraits or the portrait? Or
Michelle would like to know, she noticed that Mary's wartime portrait doesn't look quite as hourglass shaped as the younger portrait. Was that due to change in fashion of portrait painting, or was this because it was post-childbirth?
no. Great. Very
Yeah. Are you, so they're talking about this portrait, yes? It could also be a bit of the style as well, fashion-wise, because it looks like we're getting more towards like a higher waistline as well. Sort
yeah,
of
a little bit of a higher waistline. Copley loved to show textile, so this pink scarf, I mean, it's hard to know whether it's kind of an unusual scarf drapery here, but
Yeah.
I think, you know, Copley loved to show off his rendering of textiles. You know, I think that this is a little bit of her expression. This is 20 years after, more than 20 years after her portrait as a young woman. This is a woman who's seen a little bit more of life, I think.
She's in her 40s.
Yeah, there's a soberness here. There's a dignity here. And, you know, when I think about those years that she was in the city without Roger, with the children during the war, I can imagine this woman. This is painted a little bit before the revolution, but this is the woman who I can picture surviving that, or evacuating from Mount Morris and you know, keeping things together in order to be reunited with Roger. I think there's a real, you know, there's something a little bit more of experience in this portrait. A little bit more of a, I don't know, there's a sort of worldliness here than young Mary.
Yeah. All right. Well, I would like to, again, thank you, Jessa, for joining us for this conversation about Mary. I'd like to thank all of our virtual attendees. And I just wanted to let you know before we say goodnight that following this chat, there will be a brief survey emailed to you just to give us some feedback on what you thought of our conversation, what you would like to see for additional future virtual parlor chats, which will happen monthly on the third Wednesday of each month. We invite you back next month on June 17th at 7 for our next parlor chat, quote, Why the Census Matters, Past and Present, with Sarah Maleka from the U.S. Census Bureau. Also, we'll be sending you additional resources about this topic in that same survey email. And we hope that you will be able to visit our institutions online, right now digitally, but hopefully in person soon. So thank you, one and all. Good night and be well.